Hello. We're going to first start with the Valiant Voices, How Can He Change Part 2. And we're going to start with a land acknowledgement. We gratefully acknowledge that the Indigenous people of the lands we are on today, even though we are meeting in a virtual space, it is important for us to recognize that we have and continue to benefit from the theft and occupation of this land since even before the United States was formed as a nation. Global Rights for Women is located in Minneapolis, Minnesota, with staff throughout Minnesota. And we acknowledge that we are on Dakota and Anishinaabe land. We recognize the historic discrimination and violence that have been inflicted upon Indigenous people globally. Additionally, we understand the treatment of Indigenous women is a byproduct of colonialism, racism, and misogyny that has perpetuated the continued sexual abuse, disappearance, and murder of Indigenous women here in Minnesota and in many places around the world. So please join us now in a moment of reflection to acknowledge the harm of the present and past, and to consider how you can join the effort to dismantle the continued oppression of Indigenous communities and restore justice. And also, since people are joining here from around the world, at this time, if you would like to put into the chat the land that you are acknowledging, we would appreciate that. Thank you for coming. Thank you so much for coming to Global Rights for Women's conversation series, Valiant Voices. I'm Lori Flohog. My pronouns are she and her, and I'll be today's moderator. I'm the Director of Law and Policy for Global Rights for Women, an organization with a mission to end domestic and sexual violence around the world. Valiant Voices is a conversation series created by Global Rights for Women that features the human rights advocates and survivors who are addressing injustice and disrupting oppressive systems that cause harm. These are the stories of powerful leaders creating change in their communities and around the world. We are live streaming on Facebook today and welcome your comments there, or in the Q&A section on Zoom. And after the conversation, we'll be sending out a link with the recording. If you need a certificate of attendance, please contact Sophia Morissette, and that's at SMORISSETTE@grwomen.org. So I am beyond delighted and pleased to introduce our panelists to you. We're going to first start with Mr. Ulester Douglas, who has provided training in 40 states, Europe, and the Caribbean to community organizations, universities, corporations, and government agencies, and authored many articles and curricula on family violence and other human rights issues. Thank you so much for coming, Ulester. I'd also like to welcome Mr. Scott Miller, who is the Executive Director for the Domestic Abuse Intervention Programs. Scott trains internationally on the Duluth Model method of organizing, develops specific community interventions, and creates new curricula for communities working to end violence. Thank you so much for coming, Scott. And in her position as the Director of International Training at Global Rights for Women, Ms. Melissa Skaya co-facilitates groups for men who batter and women who use violence. As a qualified expert in the state of Minnesota, she testifies as an expert witness on domestic violence in criminal court cases. Thank you so much, Melissa, and thank you all so much for joining us. So we're going to start with some questions. This is part 2 of a series. We had an earlier session talking about whether men can change. And now we're going to talk about programs and how men can change. So I'm going to first start with you, Yolester. There is a raging debate today in advocacy about effective approaches to men's behavior change, be it an anger management or trauma-informed or restorative justice or the criminal justice system, etc. Could you please talk to us a little bit about which approaches are effective to change men's behavior?
Hello, everyone. I think I'll go ahead and start the conversation by talking a bit about trauma-informed approaches. That's the angle I'll take to your question, and I know Scott and Melissa will pick up on the other aspects of your question. Indeed, Laurie, it is quite controversial. There are lots of conversations happening here in the United States and across the globe about the issue of trauma-informed approaches to intervention programs with men who abuse women. One of the challenges is that there are varied definitions about what it means to be trauma-informed. I mean, I did a search and it's all over the place. What does this really mean? So one of the ones I'll share comes from the University of Buffalo School of Social Work, because I think it has a number of the elements in many of the definitions that I've seen when, again, talking about what it means to have a trauma-informed approach. And this definition suggests that it assumes that an individual is more likely than not to have experienced trauma, some trauma in that individual's history, and that it requires us as community folks working to address so many of these social concerns to make a paradigm shift from asking what is wrong with this individual and shifting towards what was done, to this individual. It also suggests that it is not necessarily about trying to address the trauma and the associated issues. That is not what, at least this definition asserts. It's more, at least, to be aware and to think about how to make services accessible and to make appropriate services for individuals who likely have experienced some form of trauma. Now, one of the other challenges that this presents for intervention program for men who abuse women is that there aren't even any shared understanding or agreement about what is trauma. That's another challenge, right? We got trauma-informed, various definitions about what that means, and what is trauma. So I thought, okay, let's look at what three of what many would consider authoritative bodies, again, certainly clinically speaking, but let's just start there. So I looked at the American Medical Association's definition and the American Psychological Association's definition, also Dr. Bessel van der Kolk's definition. The reason I looked at van der Kolk's was because by many, he is considered one of the quote unquote world's foremost authority on trauma. And I want to start there again intentionally, because a lot of folks who are doing conducting intervention programs for men who abuse women, many have a strong clinical bent. So I'm intentional in starting there. What all of these three definitions have in common is that they have a shared understanding that there was some kind of exposure, an experience to a traumatic event, which had a negative impact on that individual's psychology as well as physiology. So that's one feature in all of those three definitions. Another one is that this event instilled a sense of fear and hopelessness. And the third is how that individual function, that it affects their function in the world. What those definitions lack is again, context. And this is not surprising in part part one of the series, I and Scott and Missy, we talked about the tendency, certainly here in the United States, to decontextualize social issues, number one, and that insistence on focusing on individual to make these social concerns to be about individual failures or even individual successes. So here we go again in those three definitions with, again, presumably two of the most authoritative bodies in the United States and one of the apparently foremost authority in trauma across the globe. What they lack, again, is context. And so what I propose for intervention programs for men who abuse women is to look at the issues of oppression and the interconnectedness and what I call, think of them in terms of, I'm gonna say trauma-inducive conditions. That's one way to think of it. So you have these trauma-inducive conditions, and within them, they contribute to a lot of individual events that are traumatic for folks who experience it. Let's take white supremacy and patriarchy as a start. We know that white supremacy and patriarchy that are founded on a violent stream. Violence is the foundation on which white supremacy and patriarchy has been constructed. And not only it is the foundation, it is also what sustains them. Okay, and I think that's a really critical point because let me just be redundant here. In order for these systems, these socio-political systems to continue to exist, it requires violence or the threat of violence. So these interconnected systems are really powerful and complex traumatic forces that are at the core of the daily experience of trauma for so many marginalized individuals and communities. We know, for example, I mean, let's just take, the violence in Buffalo, several weeks ago, where 10 folks were killed, African Americans. That's an individual, right, who commit those acts of violence. But he did not commit it without context. The context is that Black folks, immigrants, are a threat, attempting to replace the white race, and we must eradicate that. That's a context in white supremacy, and that kind of narrative is propagated all the time. And so here's this individual man acting on that kind of directive, the use of violence and the threat of violence to keep these folks in place. And so even if you're African American, yeah, you weren't in Buffalo, you weren't directly impacted, you weren't in the grocery store. Every African American Black folks across this country and beyond were impacted. Because we know when we walk down the street, walk in a grocery store, wherever we are, there is the constant threat of violence. Likewise for women, likewise for trans folks, queer folks, there's this constant threat. And so why aren't we thinking about that as trauma, as trauma-inducive conditions contribute to the many events like the one in Buffalo? And so that's my challenge to intervention program, is to make that, central to the intervention. Also, let me just highlight another one that's certainly ongoing, because we know with patriarchy and white supremacy, ultimately this is about an insistence in trying to control the bodies, the beings of women and people of color. Let's take reproductive justice, right? Reproductive rights. It's all about controlling women's bodies, and it is men's insistence in doing this. So now, one of the questions and challenges in intervention program is, in addition to what is trauma, is like, do we address it at all, and how? I would offer that the thing to do, again, given the limited time in these intervention program, is to make the connections between these trauma-inducive conditions, these forms of oppression, and individual choices, if you may. I know the caution is, oh, here we go. to do this might be giving these, these men, an excuse for their behavior. I think, no, it is possible to make the connection and put the emphasis on the oppressions, these trauma-inducive conditions, and invite men into seeing that, hey, here are the consequences for women and children and marginalized folks. And for you, it's costly for you too. It is not working in your interest. The promises of patriarchy, it's not been delivered. It's costing men in horrible ways that we are unwilling to know or to act on. I think that is one of the responsibilities of intervention program, is to make that evident. And so I'm going to, pause there. But the take home from that last portion for me is for intervention programs to make this connection and invite men into a different construct of masculinity, of ways of thinking about how to move through the world, and to reject this very destructive patriarchal construct of masculinity that is not working for men, really, at the end of the day, certainly not working for women and children. It's really not working for us, despite the contrary. I'll pause there.
Well, thank you. So Scott, then, is the answer then that these traumatized men need to work on anger management type issues? Can you speak a little bit to kind of the anger management approach and how that works within this system of behavior change?
Well, yeah, it's not about anger. For one, it's how he thinks about himself and what he gets to do, and how that's been socially constructed, and created whatever identity he has as a man. If it was just about anger, it would be, I think, a simpler solution. So I think that, some of these ideas around, and I think the research bears that out, and there hasn't been a lot recently about it, because I think the conversation is pretty conclusive that it isn't effective, or a type of intervention that you want to create with men who are committing acts of battering. But I think one other one that I think has some resonance, that is also causing a lot of controversy, is restorative justice. Domestic violence advocates, and this is internationally where I go, or where I've been, struggle with the idea of the restorative framework, oftentimes because it puts the victim and the offender in the same space, and it doesn't account for that power difference that she has to contend with. And so about 20 years ago here in Duluth, we started having these conversations between corrections and some of the advocates, and then the rest of the advocates in our community. And this is a very, very hard conversation to have. And they brought in traditional restorative justice folks. And I remember sitting in a room, and we were all watching this particular community who had really embedded restorative justice in their response to domestic violence. And the video was a sentencing circle, where they had come to a sentence for this individual for the domestic crime that he had committed. And there was about, I think, 10, 12 people in the circle. And the circle keeper read the sentence as they collectively had come to agree upon, and said, okay, so today we're going to agree upon this sentence, or not. And so the sentence was read, the talking piece was passed to his left, and it went around the room. It passed the person who had committed the violence, and he agreed to the sentence, and it went around the room. And the last person it went to was the victim of his violence. And all of us from the advocacy community looked and said, what was she going to say? When 12 other people have all agreed to this, is she going to be the one person to say, no, I don't think this is okay, in that space? So we just really felt like that there needed to be adjustments to the way in which that was applied to this particular problem. that you couldn't take this problem of intimate partner violence against women, gender-based violence against women, and plop it into that framework and have it work, because it wasn't accounting for those power issues. So we spent a lot of time trying to figure that out. And Men as Peacemakers, which is an organization here in Duluth, took it on and created an advisory group of all kinds of different community folks from government systems and community-based agencies to help direct and it's taken a long time, and we still are adapting what we're doing to try and figure out what works. And the one thing that when I listen to restorative practitioners nationally talk, that they don't seem to address is the lack of capacity. When you have 5 volunteers from the community to be part of an individual circle, the amount of work it takes to find all of those people, train them, get them to commit to this individual's circle, whether it's a sentencing circle or repairing the harm, or however that circle is, whatever the goal of that circle is. You're not going to run, like in our community, 350 guys a year through it. It's just not possible. So what we did in Duluth is we designed that circle space for the highest risk individuals, the people who go through the response that we've designed here over 40 years, which we can see, at least from a recidivism point of view, that it impacts the men, that most of the men don't end up back in family court, in criminal court, or even arrested, not convicted. But there's this, and this is a lot of places that I go, there's about 15 to 20% of the guys who commit the majority of reassaults, and nothing that we designed seems to have resonance with them. So we thought if we added this piece where they're doing individual work with a group of community members, that might help. And it has for some of the men. And it's a lower number of men that we're working with in a more manageable scope of getting volunteers involved and training them and keeping that all going. So if you want more information about that particular response, there is Men as Peacemakers in Duluth, which you could contact Laura Anderson. Also on this call, Chris Godsey from the Minnesota Department of Corrections Restorative Unit, who used to run that program, is also on this particular call, and he's another person that you could contact for how the intersection of restorative justice and domestic violence can work. I can tell you, I came into it highly skeptical, but when I went through the process that the men were going to go through as it was being designed, there is no question there is a power in that space. And when we interview men who go through that, and so just to give you a quick idea of what they'll do, if they are say facing a prison commit because of the amount of violence and the number of convictions that they've had, they're offered this sentencing circle, not sentencing circle, but restorative circle process, and they will also have to do chemical dependency treatment if that's what's required, mental health if that's what's required. They'll have to do our men's nonviolence program as part of that sentence. So they're doing everything that somebody else in that position would do, and they're going to be doing this other piece. And so we've had the opportunity to interview men about the power of both. And one of the things that the men say about the circle process that have been in the groups that I've been in is that there's a real intimacy, that they can be transparent about things that would be harder to talk about in a room full of 15 other men, because they really get to know that core group of volunteers, and they build all that trust in the room and respect for one another. And so they talk about the power of really unpacking who they are in that space. But what they said they don't get, which is what they get from the men's program, and this is restorative folks or not, it's other men's stories and how helpful that collective conversation is inside that room to helping them understand who they are, what they've done, and the impact of that. And so it's interesting to listen to the men who've went through it talk about what they're getting from each and how both processes are contributing to what they need to choose a nonviolent lifestyle. So yeah, I'll leave it there. But if you're from the advocacy end of things and you have reservations about restorative justice, I get it. But there is a way to do it, I believe, that can be helpful to those who need more time to dig out of whatever situation that they've found themselves in. So I'll leave it at that. And Melissa, to you.
Well, and one of the things, so I'm looking at Chris O'Sullivan's comment, specifically about, trauma being the underlying, and I think that you, Lester, and Scott, you've both alluded to this as well. And Melissa, I'd sure like your response on this. But if, trauma caused domestic violence, then by its very nature, women should be more violent. And Black women experience violence through white supremacy and male supremacy. And therefore, it makes sense that Black women should be the most violent of all. So, due to being the most traumatized. So, Melissa, maybe you want to talk a little bit about that, and then we can get some input from you, Lester, and Scott as well.
Well, actually, what I'd like to do, Lauren, it's okay. I think this was a question for you, Lester. So if it's okay, if it came up, you, Lester, after you were talking. So not that I don't want to answer it, you, Lester, but I know it came up when you were sort of speaking. So I just want to give him the opportunity first.
Sure, I think that's a really important observation. And I'm so glad I don't remember the name of the person who advanced it. I think, yes. So one answer is, who gets permission to be violent, right? So yeah, so even though, let's say, Black women, experience all the kind of traumas that we talk about, but but the consequences for acting on it, women are told, the expectation is women would be victimized, and to internalize that victimization with all that comes with that. But for men, whatever harm is done to us, the training is we act it out. And there is a lot of support and reward for acting out, particularly, again, the more privileged you are. So we see white men who can be angry and aggressive, and they're celebrated, they're promoted, they get all sort of rewards for it. That's not what's happening for women and women of color and other marginalized folks at all. So to me, that is one of the responses to the difference. I mean, we see, for example, it's like when a woman, for example, commits violence, the consequences are many times, fold. It's kind of, how dare you step out of your role and do what men do? So the penalties, the sentencing are aggressive. And it's a signaling and a policing of women about what is permissible and not, even though they are experiencing that kind of trauma at higher rates. So those are my thoughts, my initial thoughts on it.
Yeah, I think I would add, you, Lester, part of what I was thinking about when I saw that question come up, and hi, Chris, good to hear from you. We also sort of thinking about it, then, men's violence is against women predominantly, not just against anyone, right? So why is it that men get permission to use it against women and children more than any other group, right? Towards what you, Lester's talking about. And, as a victim of sexual assault myself, I wouldn't get permission to go out, right, and harm. I would be held accountable into account. And to Lester's point also, I mean, we have political officials and leaders, right, who are celebrated in the way that you're saying as white men when they're using this violence in the same way that if men of color, women of color just don't get the social permission to do it. And I also think part of it is that, you know, in this work, the talking about sexism and patriarchy is sometimes feels lost and not talked about very often in this work. And it's part of the reason why we get men together in a space and have them talk about these issues together. I think also as it relates to thinking about this for men, I'm also curious about how sort of programs think about doing this, to your point, Lester, about doing that trauma work with men when we're lots of men in that sort of space also don't want to share those experiences. And what they're willing to share also is the collective experience. And there's a whole bunch of other things about fundings for the program that's sort of boring to a lot of people that I'm not going to mention. But Scott, do you want to comment about Chris's comment before we go on?
Yeah, so, you know, if you have 10 people who experience, and I grew up being sexually abused by 2 different men. So if you have a group of people, men and women of all races and genders and gender identities lined up who have experienced the same kind of sexual trauma as children, what is going to make them different? It's what Lester and Melissa is talking about. What permission do you get to do with it, right? So when I was in my early 20s and I went through therapy to deal with the trauma of my childhood, you know, that was my work, right? And I got through it. And my therapist at one point says, "Okay, you've done your work. It's time to go live your life," right? So I started to go live my life. But because I had a father who was dominant in the home and enforced it with the threat of violence or violence, that was the male identity that I, you know, basically was taught as a child. All that work on trauma was real. I mean, it really did save my life. But what positioned me to be sitting here today was working through the identity that I was given as a white middle-class male who gets to do things, gets to take things, gets to decide things, right? Like all of that was handed to me. And now I have to unpack that because that wasn't part of this process. So the complexity of who we are and what we carry, the trauma isn't pretend. It isn't something to be ignored. At the same time, I think what the struggle is that when, as Lester said, a lot of people's orientation to this work is clinical, that seems to be where the energy goes. And what gets lost is the socially constructed idea of who I am as a man and walk into that room with, and all the privileges and entitlements that I have that change what I do with my trauma. It gives me permission to do things. So I think that is basically how I was hearing both what Melissa and Lester was talking about, is that it's not just one thing. It's also who you are, what permissions you've been given, and what entitlements that you've been handed that give you what permissions, basically, to do all kinds of different things with it that somebody else wouldn't have.
I was thinking about Scott, a guy this week in group, he was saying, we were talking about minimizing what we've done and denying it and blaming our partners for it. And he said, you know, the thing is that I just can't imagine I'm ever wrong with her. You know, that's just not a notion when I ever enter into a conversation with her that I'm wrong about it, or that she has something that's of value to share with me. That's a thinking, right? That when he comes into a conversation with a woman's about that's disconnected from any traumatic experiences he's had, but he's given lots of messages about that. This is how you think about entering into a conversation, you know, with his girlfriend or wife. which is a very different conversation.
Yeah, I remember being a new facilitator, and I was co-facilitating with somebody who was the first woman hired by this agency in 1984 to do groups. So she had this tremendous experience doing the work, and I'm brand new. And she was mentioning that she said, just this very, very simple thing. Do you know that when you leave the building, you failed to lock the door? Because I've caught that a couple of times. I said, no, that's not true. She said, well, it is true, and you think it isn't. Both things for you seem to resonate, but that doesn't make it true. And it was like 100,000 examples like that, where my brain just went, no, because I don't think that way. That's not true. That's what I was handed. That's what I got to believe about my behavior, my actions. Like, that's the unpacking that never ends. That somebody else isn't going to be handed that, right?
Yeah.
I remember working with in this agency, and there was a woman who needed a mattress to have overnight visits with her kids. And she said, well, I just need a mattress, right? And so she said, why don't you go to the mattress store, because they have old mattresses that we could get. And I didn't never, because of my economic privilege, I never even thought of that, right? So we go over there, and I look at these things and I think, well, I wouldn't let anything sleep on these things. They're terrible, right? So I called her and I said, these are just not in good shape. I don't think you will. And she said, just give it up. Just quit. It's not going to happen. And that's her life experience talking as an African-American woman who was poor, who had just finally got housing and was trying to get a mattress. My experience was, no, I'm going to make this work, because that's what my experience told me, right? And I'm going to get somebody to give up a mattress. And that's who I was socially constructed to be, right? Somebody who believes that because I want something, I'm going to get it.
Right. And in the same way, Scott, I think also as women for this conversation, the number of messages that we get about being polite, right? Our job is like, don't push too hard, don't try and, get your way too much, and just be okay with some things is important.
Right.
Yeah. And connected to that is the training of men. And I do mean training, etched or imprinted in our brains, to see women as a threat. Just when you just break it down, that's the bottom line, is they are a threat. And your responsibility as a man, that's the instruction in patriarchy, is to contain her, is to control her, to avoid that threat. Same way for people of color, that is generally white training, is that these folks, let's take one ethnic group, African Americans, are dangerous. Black men are the embodiment of violence. He is to be contained, and police have been trained. I mean, we hear the stories like down in Florida, I think a couple of years ago, in the police actual training around the use of pistols was pictures of Black men on the wall to shoot. So that's the kind of undoing that we are up against when you have these, groups of folks being seen as a threat and a danger to be contained and to be destroyed.
Right. Which I think is a little bit related to, Lori, what we also were mentioning about the criminal justice response, which is to think about, how should we be thinking about a criminal justice response in this regard? And, having worked in Duluth and northern Minnesota and Minneapolis, wow, what a stark difference. And I think in part, one of the things and questions that I sort of ask about and I would have communities ask is, have you asked survivors, right? When they need help, who do they want to have come help, right? Most survivors, when they're calling the police or anyone, need help in a moment. And for many survivors, the police are not that. In other communities, in some rural areas, for example, it's the only option. There are no other options of who to call. What we do know, though, in part, is that we can't have violence with impunity, that we need to think about some consequence, and we have to think about what consequence means for us as well. But to your point, Lester, like in a city like Minneapolis, where our office is, we're spending the time now asking survivors and asking lots of Black women survivors to say, is this a group, are you going to be calling the police still? Are you not? What would be helpful? And what we find is a lot of communities don't take the time to do that, which is instead what they do is they just try and do some reforms that don't include the voices of the survivors, because we're committed that if survivors come back and say, no, not the police, then our job is to work to create something else. But we're still, exploring to find out what those voices are. I do think it's a challenge, though, when, in most men's groups have an overrepresentation of men of color in their groups. When you look at sort of the population data, which is a problem. I mean, that's kind of anywhere. And so then the question is, what's the responsibility of the men's program when you keep seeing, too large of a representation of the population of men of color is who gets referred to your groups?
So we're gonna go on to kind of a next question and a different focus. And maybe Melissa, will start with you, but knowing that perpetrators get a lot of support within the culture for thinking of their partners as less than him, just as Scott was talking about. What is going to compel men to continue to address their own behavior and those gender biases?
Well, it can't just be a group. So I would say that first of all, like we have asked men the question, we've said, tell us about when you're arrested or you had the order for protection served on you, and tell us about when your family members and your friends and basically your community found out about it. Tell us the messages that you got from your community of people. And overwhelmingly what men said is that men said, it was my coworker said, you got that woman judge, you live in Minnesota, it's a woman's state. Another guy says, you have to hit her where the cops can't see it. Another guy says, well, my mother said she's a bitch and she deserves it. So our work, can't just be that in this space. I think part of what we talked about last time was that men get a lot of permission outside of what happens in the group to continue to use violence. That's overwhelmingly the messages they get, right? To be dominant, to not take it from the woman. Don't let her talk back to you. That bitch just needs to shut up. All those sort of permissions happen in the culture. And so you can't have men can't have an experience where this, 27 weeks is the only experience where they get this message in their life.
Any thoughts on that, Scott? Lester?
Lester, why don't you, I took a bunch of space.
Sure. I think this is a challenge for any privileged group, right? When everything is constructed for you in your interest, and you're invited into thinking that to think differently, there's really not a lot of motivation to really go the other direction, right? It's a man's world, right? And you're telling me I have to give up and move to the world in a different way when the world is mine. It's a real challenge. The more privileged one is, to really work against exactly the kind of training that they have had. So unfortunately, and it's got to look like self-interest, is to appeal to self-interest in our programs. And of course, it's going to vary from men to men. For some, it's the threat of potentially losing their children, like to invite them into to do the work. I had a guy in a different space. It wasn't an intervention space a couple of days ago who came to see me, and just genuinely African-American male, probably about 33, and things weren't going well in his marriage. And he said, my wife is that marriage is so important to me. I'll do anything. And she said, you need to go to therapy. And so This is why I'm here. I want to be a different man. It's not working for her. So I said, tell me, do you have a vision of what that man could look like? And he authentically said, I do not. Because the construction in patriarchal masculinity, in all its fragility, one of the key features is how to not be like a woman. That is the foundation of patriarchal masculinity. That is what men have internalized, how to not be like a woman. So here an invitation to construct something that is not in that frame, he generally did not know. He said, I don't know. I said, I can help you. Right? There we go, right? Melissa's guy, I can help you. So there it is, right? So it's got to be in whatever it is in his self-interest, I think, to even make any. That's
I
me,
think
that's my
this,
experience.
just to add a little, like a small story to that. I remember saying to a guy in men's group, we're talking about partnership and negotiation. And I said, could you imagine, like, you need to talk to your partner about something and
Mhm.
about sitting down with her and not first telling her the solution, but asking her what she thinks the solution is. And he just said, that's just not going to happen. I said, why? He said, because I have things to share with her, right? And I just know how it should be, right? And this is like all the small little ways that women live in the world, right? Where we experience this just sort of do it my way, this is the way it should be all the time. That's a real struggle, I think, for women. And I think related to your point too, Esther, it's a question of, when I think about intervention programs, is if a group of survivors came and observed your group, what would they see? Would they see their lived experience there? And in a lot of programs that don't talk about this stuff that we're talking about, people would be like, that's just not my experience, right? And so part of it is we have to think about how much of that experience, is in our heads of survivors as facilitators. Scott?
I just want to, when I hear about trying to find creative solutions that don't involve leverage, the leverage that Lester's talking about, which is self-interest, or in what we've traditionally used in the criminal justice system, that men will just volunteer because they know that they need the help. It's just not, that's not real. That's not who these men are. I did for the Minnesota Department of Health, this is maybe 15 years ago, they were thinking of coming up with PSAs to get men to call a 1-800 number if they were angry before they committed an act of violence, right? And so I interviewed a whole series of men individually so that they got more transparent.
We're laughing about this idea, Scott, just in case
right,
you didn't hear. We're all laughing about it.
But it was really, the thing I learned about it is that they all had essentially the same answer. And one of the guys who was the most articulate about it had been reduced to seeing his child 2 hours a year because he'd almost killed the child in a violent act, right? So they said, if something came on the radio, if something came on the television that was a commercial or a audio spot about like this committing acts of violence, I would have thought those guys need help because that's not me, right? Yeah. And it wasn't even me after I almost killed my child.
That's right.
Because when I got arrested, I said, this is not me, right? Like, this isn't who I am. So when we're thinking of creative solutions outside of government systems that have the ability to impose accountability and leverage people into things that they don't want to do, like men's program, we have to think about what Lester talked about. What is their motivation to do it? And so there's a program that we've been starting to work with in Michigan where his program is going around working within the African-American community with fathers who have lost contact with their kids. The self-interest is, I want to reconnect with my children. I want to see them, right? Okay, now I need to talk to the mom. Well, okay, but he did this, he did this, he did this. Okay, so then we got to work on this before we can get there. His self-interest is he wants to connect with his kids. That's what's got him into the space. But now he's agreeing to work on himself as a man to better position himself so that she feels like she can trust him with the children because of who he had exhibited himself to be prior. So that piece, whatever the design is, has to be an element of the design. What is going to be their self-interest? And then if they get into it, what's going to keep them in it? Right? Because once they start, I mean, you illustrate the story you told, right? I mean, I've had so many guys get to that point. Now, this guy was committed. He doesn't want to lose his family, but I've had guys come in with the same motive, the same language, right? I don't want to lose my family. I got kicked out of the house. I can't come back till I go to group. All right. And we start doing group. And he said, this is, I'm not doing this. like I thought it maybe was like, but it's not. So I'm just gonna leave. And the biggest dropout rate that we have here is volunteers because the work is hard and it's long. And they just basically choose. Like one guy said, you know, if I have an old truck, this is his analogy to the problem with his family. If I have an old truck, do I want to keep pouring money into something that I'm going to have to keep pouring money into, or just buy a new truck? Right. So there we are. Right. That's the, in essence, that's the struggle. So if you don't have a way of leveraging or creating tremendous incentive, you're not going to get the attendance.
It makes me think about, you know, those basic needs, and in trying to put together whatever efforts to, you know, engagement, the issue of identity, belonging, and purpose. You know, this quest for those three, where do I get those? And that's why for a lot of men, that's what makes work so appealing. You know, it's, I've got to be a man. I am providing and I'm doing all this stuff. Never mind what's going on at home. I'm just, you know, I've got identity, I've got belonging, I've got purpose, you know. So that, what you just said, Scott, made me think about that, you know.
So we have a few minutes left, and there's quite a few comments in the chat, you know, specifically talking about women who are contributing to toxic masculinity, or remembering that, you know, more women raise males than men, thinking that, well, maybe, you know, the issue is we just need to raise better men.
Yeah.
I recall being in court on a case where a man was coming into court for assaulting his wife, and his mother was with him, and she said, "I'll take all that paperwork." So, you know, can someone talk a little bit about you know, that role?
Well, so I'm kind of looking upstairs because I have a teenage boy upstairs, see if he's going to overhear me say this. But I just have to tell you that if I was the biggest influence on my teenage son, I would love it. I am not. I am not the biggest influence on his life. The culture has taken him in ways and given him messages that are stronger and repetitive and reinforced in more ways than this feminist mother can overcome, not just influence him, but yet overcome, that have been a struggle. So we have to, this is why we have to think about this as the cultural permissions, right? That young boys and the cultural messages that they get, you know, from this age. But I am far from the largest influence. And I also think as it relates, you know, to women, you know, and young girls, it's the same thing. I'm just not the biggest influence. I also think that when we're thinking about these issues and thinking about all the things we've talked about also, is that as it relates to intimate partner heterosexual relationships, and of course, acknowledging that's not all relationships, but an intimate partner heterosexual, we also have to get away from this thinking that it's all the same. that all the violence is the same by men and women in intimate partner heterosexual. It's not the same lived experience predominantly. Women don't get the same social permissions to do what men get to do. And so it's a mistake when we create these interventions to think that this is the same as well.
Any other thoughts on that? We've got about 4 minutes left. So, again, we want to talk specifically about, some of the issues relative to, how can men change? And one of the questions that we have is, if you're working within this social problem and you're working within the social change place, facilitators, as Melissa just indicated, a facilitator doesn't get to opt out of the problem. And so, maybe Scott, you, Lester, Melissa, why is it important for facilitators to do their own work? And what does that even look like?
In 3 minutes?
Yeah, that's a big one.
3 minutes. Tell us about the work.
Don't ask men to do something you're not willing to do yourself. In a quick little statement.
Yeah, I would add that it's foundational to just doing the important and necessary work. We are the work, and I think one of the consequences of not doing our own work is collusion or distancing, and neither one is going to work well in the interest of survivors and victims. I've quoted in many other spaces, Reader, let me get his name, Reaver Chandra's quote that, the unit of change, is we, and I think that's an important reminder to locate ourselves as part of the problems as well.
And just a friendly message also, I think, for all the male co-facilitators out there too, which part of that work, is to take the time to listen in about what survivors' lived experiences are. If you're a male facilitator, and I would ask you, when's the last time you've, kind of been paying attention to what the lived experience is for women, right? To be able to understand that and hear that and be connected to survivors and advocates. I mean, a lot of men's programs, unfortunately, think that women's programs are annoying. They want them to sign off on MOUs to get, on grants. And that's about the extent of the relationship. So I think it's real important for that. And then also just lastly, I'd say that, the work of co-facilitation is hard. Modeling and living equality is hard. Most people don't have that figured out in the best of relationships. And so to Lester and Scott's point, which is that it's our work on a continual basis.
Yeah, when we used to have in-person trainings, one of the things we could do is we'd break the men and women up into different rooms. Co-facilitator, co-trainer with me, Carol, would take the women and I'd sit with the men, and we talk about co-facilitation. And the women just immediately, as soon as the door was closed, like, these are all the things that I get cut out of. This is how he takes over the space. This is how I don't have a voice. This is how I'm his secretary. This is how I have to make the coffee and take the money, and he just shows up and starts talking. Like, it just is a barrage, right? Mm-hmm. And in the space with the men, it's this conversation of them contemplating if it actually is a problem. And maybe at the end of 30, I remember at the end of an hour, there was a guy who was thoughtful. I mean, he wasn't, being overtly resistant, but he said, I'm open to the idea that this is something to pay attention to. I thought, there it is. Like, that is such a statement of privilege, right? Like, I'm open to the idea that this reality might be something to pay attention to, right? So yeah, we are the work.
Yeah.
Well, I cannot believe that we've already come across an hour. I feel like we could sit here and have these conversations and talk with all of our participants for the next few hours. But I would really like to thank our guests for talking to us today and thank our participants for being here. I also really want to reach out and thank my colleagues, Patricia and Sophia, for ensuring that this conversation went smoothly on the technical side of things. We have included the links in the chats to learn more. And if you would like to support global rights for women, your contribution goes to supporting the work of advocates around the globe. Centering survivors' voices, as Melissa and Scott and you, Lester, have discussed, as the means to achieve systemic change. You are all going to receive an email in the next few days with resources, as well as a link to this recording. And again, thank you so much for being here. It was an absolute honor to share this space with all of you. And thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay.